As a Tamara announcement, my name is Carmela Krleža-Jerić, and I would like to declare I have no conflict of interest, but I do have interest in research, public disclosure of research data. And so that will be the first poll now, if it could be done. So the whole story will include discussion of clinical trials data, transparency, etc. So I would like to start with clinical trial definition by the World Health Organization, which is any research study that prospectively assigns human participants or groups of humans to one or more health-related interventions to evaluate the effect of health outcomes. And I like to emphasize, it is also part of the definition that interventions include anything, not just medication. So then the other thing which we are talking about basically is data of clinical trials, of course. So data, information we collect when we measure something, and it can be data, metadata, which is description of the data. Then we talk about clean data, which is preparation to analyze it, aggregate or summarize data that's already processed. But then what we are particularly interested in is raw data, and in our case, it's individual participant data or IPD. And finally, it has to be specified that we are talking about anonymized, cleaned, analyzable IPDs, something that's useful, right? So I'd like to remind you on the evidence pyramid, which is showing the hierarchy of evidence, the evidence which becomes more usable, so to say, or trustworthy to be used as we go up the pyramid. And so we have from animal and in vitro through observational, interventional, critical appraisal studies. At one time, we thought that randomized controlled trial was on the top. Then we realized that we have to synthesize evidence gained by 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 trials, as many as we have. And then we realized we had to do meta-analysis of aggregate data. But later on, not much later, then we realized that actually we should be able to reanalyze raw data or IPDs from individual trials to get more trustworthy evidence to use in our evidence-informed decision-making. But don't think that top of the pyramid is it, the end, because research and knowledge continually evolves. So I like always to show this to remind you the same story is that's a life of one clinical trial database. You have intervention, you have data which becomes findings, analyzer gets results, that's the information, which becomes evidence, combined with other evidence and direct experience, it becomes knowledge. Then that gives us a wisdom that we can intervene or do decisions or develop new therapies. And then we go again and improve eternally. And there are many examples of how that goes. So data sharing then will contribute, as we noticed, to the research integrity, beside the things we showed, to research integrity, the quality of studies, reducing the waste of research, reliability of evidence. Then it would increase the knowledge creation, as you showed on the pyramid, to get better diagnostics and therapies, which would improve health of people. And also, very importantly, we should regain or gain or keep the public trust. So these items will be all much more in details also explained in the next webinar in a month's time. But it's all of that is the basis of why we do want to have data shared. So this is my dream to have. So the trial starts with this design based on the systematic review. Then we write a protocol and send it through ethics approval, and then protocol elements are posted in the trial registry. And we shall describe it more registry later. And then at the end, sometimes trials are long, and if there are any updates or changes for protocol, we should register them as well in the registry. And then when we analyze the trial, we should post summary data, aggregate data in the results database. The results and findings are also published in journals, and then all trial documentation and, of course, all raw data or IPDs are in trial repository. And all these three things are cross-reference. So anywhere we touch, we can know what's happening elsewhere. There are some intermediaries that are helping this happen, as we shall discuss later on. It's not just directly always, but that will be the open access. So now it's time for the poll next poll, which is about systematic review. So I would like to introduce you quickly into the Impact Observatory, through which I learned a lot of information that I'm sharing today. So IMPACT stands for Improving Access to Clinical Trial Data, and Observatory is ongoing transition of clinical research regarding data sharing, particularly analyzing opportunities and barriers. So that, now I would like to point that observatory or natural experiment is one type of epidemiological study, which is studying research about research. So experiment is not controlled by research by me, let's say, and there is no intervention. So that's a big difference between that and clinical trial, which we saw has intervention. It identifies changes or transition, points to barriers of, in our case, and facilitators of, in our case, of the opening of data, access to data, measures the impact of those changes on research and informs trends. So to make it visually more easily seen, the Impact Observatory is studying, exploring development in the past, examine ongoing changes, assess the impact of those changes, and establish the potential future development. So we started by defining the baseline, because if you want to measure changes in time, you have to have a baseline first defined. And we presented this poster in Paris at the RDA meeting, and then we completed it with a study. So baseline was defined that the environment, research and general environment should be ready. Some things had to be fulfilled before that. We had to know what data said, tried one meta-analysis, studied EBM or evidence-based medicine initiatives, Cochrane collaboration, and trial registries were formed. So we chose key milestones as determining this baseline. And so the John Sims called for trial registration in 1984 as a means to control bias in publication bias. Jean-Pierre Pignot did the first meta-analysis a little later. Then evidence-based medicine was formed and defined as a conscientious, explicit use of current best evidence in making decisions about care. There was a fear by that time that some health professionals are not using scientific evidence, but just on work based on the initially learned and then continued on the practice. Then Cochrane collaboration was formed, calling for systematic reviews and meta-analysis of aggregate and individual participant data coming from clinical trials, like for the synthesis of evidence. And then we noticed by the baseline that quite often something would happen and there were reactions and pushes from several branches of medicine particularly, and sometimes, especially something went wrong, the media would jump in and discuss it. So there was so-called, we call them scandals. So there was Nancy Olivieri scandal was when Nancy Olivieri disclosed adverse effects of drug in a study, despite threats of drug developer Apotex. That helped us in Canada. That was in Toronto in Canada, and much improved a lot the ethics thinking and ethics rules of how the trials could be done when they're co-funded by anyone. And then there were 2 trial registries. There was another key milestone where trial registries. So now we are at the poll on meta-analysis. So as I mentioned, data sharing, there are lots of terminologies. We use terminology transparency, which is usually transparency of research, then access. Then it's important to be able to citability to indicate where you got your data. Then findability, we learned in the relatively recently in the Corbell study that it's not so easy just to have cited and find. Then data should be made in a usability form so you can really reanalyze, and that's what's struggling. And therefore, we need to have data management plan in which we would include data sharing plan. These days, people we studied years ago, Khaled and I did a study, and we learned that most of researchers use electronic data management, so that should be, in a way, happening. And then at the end, we need standards and guidelines so we can do it internationally because studies are happening all over. Beside clinical trial area or health research, there was a movement there has been and is a movement of open access generally in science, which, let's say, the trigger or the tipping point could have been Declaration of Budapest Open Access Initiatives in 2002, which called for self-archiving and open access journal to have open access to literature, which was followed by the Linden Declaration, which defined open access as contributions that include practically everything. You can find it on the internet and read. It's everything learned through the research, so it becomes known by people. And this I found recently, it's a whole list of those open access initiatives, and I'm sure you're aware of those, even they're now having the colors like green and so on. Is the most open access is like green, that means totally unrestricted online access to research, which would then contribute to open science, which is a movement to make scientific research available and known to accessible to everybody. On the other hand, we have restricted access, which is more present in our area, which we have various forms, and there are many arrangements, like they're limited or upon request or controlled or protocol needed. But it's moving on and happening. And of course, the third type, which is not on this slide, would be no access, which we are trying at the beginning of when we started the study, there was practically no public access to data. Then we realized there are barriers, and we looked at the barriers. At the very beginning, I was wondering why, how come, what's wrong? And so these barriers that we identified few years ago at the beginning of the impact thinking was included intellectual property, resources. It takes resources to process data. There was a fear about citability and availability and academic credit. And then it was fear if you publish in somewhere your data that you won't be able to publish in a journal. And privacy anonymization, which will be particularly addressed by Khaled next time. And the data formats and standards and repositories and data exchange standards were not there. So now we are coming to the tipping point. The environment was there, the baseline was there, the atmosphere was there, but it wasn't pushing forward enough. So in 2004, the tipping point or trigger was when Glaxo had to settle to New York Attorney General and agreed that they would post all results of all clinical trials involved in drugs. And you'll see later on that it wasn't happening by all, and it sometimes created a lot of tragic consequences. But that moved the ball forward, and the ICMG, which is International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, got together and produced a statement saying they won't publish any more trials unless the protocol would be made available. So nothing could be changed or hidden, which is called then a bias. We studied that bias. And that time I worked at the CHR, which is Federal Funding Agency in Canada for health. And we did the study and we realized that even studies we funded had some publication bias, a publication by Anwen Chen. So then we were in a way lucky because in Ottawa was a Cochrane colloquium. So we used that audience and atmosphere and called the meeting during the colloquium to discuss registration of protocol information, and we developed principles for international registration of protocol and results from human trials. And you can see we published in the BMJ. We even had a website, which unfortunately doesn't work anymore. So the idea of that is very simple. You get the idea, get the protocol, the trial has the ID, and you send your data to public domain. So the trial is this circle, while public domain is this around, and you inform the public with your ID, of course, so you can be traced, protocol and results. The rationale is simple. There are ethical, scientific, and health reasons to do that. So trial registration, I promise to give some definitions, is a process of recording selected trial details and posting them on the freely available, accessible, publicly owned internet-based trial registry. So it couldn't be some unpublic, so to say, let's say one institution or one pharma company or whatever. So that at that moment, it was such a big push of all this happening that it was the big talk of it became talk of the town. And we were curious to see who was talking. And as you can see, clinicians, ICMG, trial participants, academia, public funders, and practically, let's say bravely, that it was everyone talking. So it was big events and happening. And months or 2 months later, WHO organized its ministerial summit on health research in Mexico, and they, among other things, ministers asked the WHO to get engaged to do something about trial registration, which was confirmed at the annual assembly. WHO is the intergovernment organization member of the UN, one of the agencies of UN. And so they meet once a year in May to define the next year plan, and they produce the resolution and decisions to that community, or scientific community was called to do something with trial registration, and the Director General or the WHO was asked to pursue with interested partners to develop a portal for trial registration, which they did. And they formed the advisory group and scientific advisory group, and we developed the international standards. So journal editors who were part of that group of consensus building process at WHO supported it and started talking about what was the meaning of the fully registered trial, that it couldn't be just anything. That all this had the echo all around the world. This is just one example of Salvador Declaration of Open Access in the developing world perspective. We then continued trying to see what would be the operationalization principles for trial registration, developed Ottawa Statement number 2, which was talking about WHO items and adding to them some more information if possible, like amendments, adverse events, interim analysis, etc. And in 2006, finally, these international standards were developed, and they defined the registry and 20 items that had to be registered. Nowadays, they expanded to 22. And we again got to see what happens with the results. And the Ottawa Statement 3 is talking about results disclosure, starting with concert-based. Concert is international standards to develop a report, and then adding to that an independent validation. And even if you didn't publish the study, provide individual participant level data sets and hopefully do the systematic review after the trial. So potential users of, sorry, that was too quickly, but potential users of registries were all those people that were talking practically, because they saw advantage of knowing where the trial is happening and looking then for their results afterwards. So ICMG supported that and emphasized that they wouldn't consider pre-publication if you put your data there, and they accepted WHO definition, which you saw at the beginning. and the registries which are part of the WHO network of registries. FDA, which is Federal Food and Drug Administration, also demands from that time that trial be registered or before they start in order to get the approval. And this is the network of registries with WHO portal here in Geneva. And as you can see that they are covering pretty much very much chunk. And we believe, let's say African has one registry covering the whole continent of Africa, all the countries, while in Europe you have two. And we believe more and more that it's now not important anymore to create more national registries, but countries should develop policies that people have to register trials. And that's what WHO is now following what's happening. But just another example of the policies of the Australian Code for Responsible Conduct of Research, which has been evolving all the time ever since, which includes a request for transparency of research and registration. Then I have to apologize that sometimes I add to this story some stuff that I particularly was involved in, like a Proctor. The CHR decided, okay, we now have registration going on. Let's see what's going on with reporting of trials. So we called the meeting, we called, how to say that, equal number for two people from each constituency that might be interested to sit around the table and discuss and have a dialogue on public reporting of clinical trial outcomes. So we had not just researchers, clinical trialists and funders, we also had journal editors, consumers and pharma. So the goal, then we published a short report and presented at one of the Cochrane colloquia results, but the goal was to build the dialogue, not the goal, the dialogue led to conclusion that public reporting of clinical trials will enable building research on all knowledge and not just partial. Because if you don't know what other people did, you just start from zero. Here you start with all knowledge. You can perform secondary analysis. Then we also realized that current system is suboptimal in the internet era. And without results reporting, trial registration is an unfulfilled promise. And finally, we identified the need to develop international standards for public disclosure of trial results. The internet, there is, I believe you know about the Declaration of Helsinki, which started after the Second World War and crimes performed in the Nazi Germany. The World Medical Association is developing and maintaining them, let's say, and so they meet once in a few years to revise the declaration. And the 7th revision in 2008 included the call for trial registration and result disclosure. The Europe also contributed to that. And then the important thing was that data site was formed, which we mentioned at the beginning the need to have way to cite. So this persistent identifiers are enabling citing. You know that all the scientific publications more or less have some sort of persistent identifier, and DataCite is assigning DOI. So the clinical, one of the two registries that you remember were there at the baseline, which is clinicaltrials.gov, after the analysis and discussion in public meeting decided to expand to include the registry to add results database bank. So if the trial is registered in NIH, in the clinicaltrials.gov, results can be there. And they defined the elements of the result that should be presented. Then the PAHO, what was interesting to see what would be the roadmap towards transparency. And we analyzed the prospective registration and results disclosures of clinical trials in Americas. Then I'm sure you know about All Trials Initiative started calling for all trials to be registered, all results reported. We then said, okay, this is beautiful, but people were complaining they didn't know where to put their data. So we said, let's see where there are internet-based places you can post your data. And we got funded by COPE, Committee on Publication Ethics, Ian and I applied, to do the environmental scan of repositories, to identify and explore features and practices of repositories that accept clinical trial data, including IPD, and facilitate their public disclosure. So that environmental scan, we keep continuing because the repositories keep growing and improving. It was first funded by COPE, and then I included it into Impact Observatory, so it's still ongoing. And observatory is funded by Newfair Pro, but we shall talk about it later. So research data repositories store and maintain data, provide access, archive data, and enable and share the use of archive. They are internet-based, and they are essential, I believe, and necessary to achieve the full transparency of research, to achieve the open data. The link to repositories is R3 Data, which is a registry of research data repositories, and I would like to point to all of you that are interested to learn about where to put data or where to find data, on how that thing is evolving, to look into R3 Data, because they not only list repositories, but they describe them. They describe basic features that you can see what data they hold and how they policy have, are they open and whatnot. And then there was a big outcry by President Bush speaking to industry, and the form that he asked that nothing was happening in the area of developing new therapies for cancer. So the CEO Roundtable of Cancer was formed, which is then later on produced Project DataSphere, to where researchers can find or put and analyze patient-level data of cancer trials. Cochrane collaboration vocally supported free access to all trials from all clinical trials, from all data, which is, then we developed it. At that time, we called the meeting, several of us, the Ottawa group actually was initiator of the meeting, to see how can we help improve the access to clinical trial data, and met in Ottawa and developed the so-called initiative, Impact Initiative. This screen is on the Ottawa Statement, Ottawa Group website, which, as I mentioned, doesn't exist. So Impact Initiative stands for Impact Access to Clinical Trial Data. We said we would like to explore definitions and develop methodology, standards, guidelines, and inform the operationalization of it. So that's the group. Not everybody was in the room when we took that picture, but I have another picture with few more people, just in case. So we basically, it was very inspirational meeting, and when we continued, practically all of us are involved and have been involved ever since in developing either privacy issues, methodology, or studying repositories. Then another, similar to CEO Cancer, there was another trial that Yale University started, the so-called YODA project, with first one and then two companies to make the data sharing available. Equivalent to the FDA can be seen as EMA, which is European Medicine Agency. That's the regulator that companies send the information asking for drug to get on the market. And so the EMA decided to start publishing clinical trial data they use in that process. and it's still being developed. The whole idea of how to make the balance between protection of interest industry and share the data for the interest of patients and knowledge creation. And so this is, let's say, what if you don't share data? We function in the situation of lack of information, better to say lack of evidence, and we have biased clinician. We have also biased researcher, and sponsor of the research, which leads to inefficient and irresponsible research. But the ultimate price is paid by the patient, either as a participant in that research or as a clinician, as a patient that gets not the best possible therapy. And that happened many times, and this is one of the examples that the young lady, a young woman, actually a girl, got a prescription for some medication, and when she took it, she died. And that's why it's called death by prescription. And that created, that's her father who wrote the book. And he was in the government, and so he, after long discussion, we in Canada developed the so-called Vanessa law. The name of the girl that died was Vanessa, and it's called Protecting Canadians from Unsafe Drugs Act Amendment, and we're now observing its implementation. And at the same time, I studied Impact Observatory. I got funded by European grant, Newfell Pro, which is combination of Marie Curie and Croatian government grant. And just to remind you, it's observing the transition in clinical research regarding data sharing. And as I said, it's funded by Newfell Pro, which is Marie Curie and Croatian government. It's now, when it's finished, everything, all the such things finished. So the fellowship finished. I'm now at the Mediterranean Institute of Life Sciences as visiting scientist, and it's hosted there. And I collaborated and contributed to the Corbell project with what we learned in Impact. So Impact Observatory is identifying changes in culture, perceptions, policies, to assess barriers, indicate potential trends, and that should impact transition of data sharing and the research. In the next month's webinar, I will give you some of the results and findings of what we learned about barriers, gaps, opportunities, and in the changes that we measure, because changes are happening at all levels, from researcher to consumer. So a very important step forward in the controlled but important data sharing was the clinical study, the clinical study data request, which companies listed here agreed to share their data in an organized way. And the way is that the independent review panel, which is organized and run by Wellcome Trust, is you apply and they ask, and then you'll be able to get data from several companies on the issue you are interested in, and it's working very well. And then in 2015, IOM produced a report, which is Institute of Medicine. It produced a very important document sharing clinical trial data, maximizing benefits and minimizing risks, analyzing carefully what are at stake and how to deal with that. WHO, beside running the portal for clinical trials, which is the platform, as they call it, they started talking about clinical trial results and their public disclosure, calling researchers to oblige. At that time, I would like to mention one project that Impact has been collaborating with, and that's a coordinated research of the Corbel and ECRIN. ECRIN is European Network of Clinical Trials. And so it's sharing, and we published, it worked in the consensus form, and this is one publication that was done in BMJ, producing results of that, producing principles and recommendations for sharing and reuse of individual participant data. It's open access, so you can find it. So R3 Data, which we mentioned earlier, in the meantime, got together with DataCite, which is now managing it. So all the repositories have DOI, and DataCite is helping it, assigning it, while data within repositories can have DOI or any other identifier. So this is another illustration. Now we come to another, how to say, trigger or important moment in that influenced our thinking, which was in 2016, when in spite of all that what we learned with the NESA trial and with the Glaxo, there was a trial in France, which was called French trial, that on healthy volunteers, which went wrong and people died and others had big consequences. And the issue was not just that it could have been done in a different way, but details of that trial were not disclosed. So there was a fear that somebody else might be testing similar drug and not similar molecular drug and not knowing, because it took a while to get the data out. And there was a big discussion about it. 90 people were involved. And that discussion also, let's say, is reflected here, that it was then analyzed that transparency in clinical research needs push, because the analysis was done, which showed that the information that pharma company gives to regulator to get drug on the market, approve the drug on the market, they wouldn't necessarily give all of that information along with the drug to health providers, healthcare physicians, and to know what's going on. So there still might be some side effects that are not indicated. They are not made, or some of trials are not made publicly available that are used for that proof. So that's another thing. And that was then created discussion of that sharing individual participant data in the context of trial reporting system was a point, but it didn't as yet get realized by that was written by the director of the clinicaltrials.gov, but it hasn't been yet implemented. But there are other places where you can put your data. So ICMG started discussion on sharing of clinical trial data. EMA moved on and said they would publish clinical trial data, and they keep going on, and Khaled will tell you probably more about some of these efforts because he is working with them on privacy or anonymization. And we are coming closer to our days, and journal editors finished that discussion and decided to issue the joint statement on public disclosure of results from clinical trials. And these are the signatories as of May 17, which include many public funders. And so that's another requirement. That's a data sharing requirement of International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. Which is also, sorry, I wanted to say one more word about it, that just to mention that ICMGE is a closed group that consists of several editors that are joining by invitation the core group. But most of statements accepted by or developed by ICMG have been acknowledged and accepted by the World Association of Medical Editors, which is WAMI. So there is a collaboration and echo of this thing. So now in 2018, there was another step forward that clinical study data request, which has been promoting or enabling the access to data from number of pharmaceutical companies, is now including data from got partnered, and it's including data from studies funded by several major non-profit funders: Wellcome Trust, Gates Foundation, Cancer Research UK, and Medical Research Council of UK. We shall give more details in the next time when we analyze what's the influence on such initiatives on data sharing. So just to remind you, that's not open access, that controlled access. You apply. And then the CSDR, which is this clinical study data request, is still coordinated. The peer review of it is coordinated by Wellcome Trust. And there is a new kid on the block, so to say. It's called VIVL. It's been in preparation for years, and it recently started. Is an independent non-profit organization that has developed global data sharing and analytics platform. It's actually a combination, it seems, of trial repository and the platform through which you get to the data. It's like neutral broker, and then you also have independent independent data repository, in-depth research engine, and secure environment, and you apply, and it's been peer reviewed, and then data, of course, in there should be anonymized. So I don't want us not to mention this very important association international one working on data of any research data, which is Research Data Alliance, which builds on the social and technical bridges to enable opening and sharing and reuse of data. And let's say some of the important things, they're looking into repositories, and let's say that they contributed to the development of the quality assurance of the repositories to move forward. And they work through their plenaries and working groups and opening new areas as needed to discuss. So in a conclusion, I wanted us to understand that the access to trial data is a complex process, and it's not one intervention by one player, as it's called in observatory. There is many players that interact, they do together, they influence each other, or they do some steps forward, which then moves the ball. So opening of trial data is important because we indicated at the beginning that it would help increase the quality of research, get better medications, avoid waste, avoid unnecessary trials, etc. It's doable, obviously, because when we started in 2004 and developed the Ottawa Statement, I remember I was told at CHR by a very distinguished colleague that we looked to him as Don Quixote. That, well, not something possible, but it's moved and it's improved very much since that time. There are still various gaps and issues. So we can say we are not there yet, but we are on the way, and we can all contribute to it. So the current situation, just to summarize, is that most data is not publicly available, that city data in the public domain would be the ones on protocol, when it's intra-registered, that's more and more happening. Few protocols also published in open access journals. Results aggregate data in few trial registries, currently only 2, you'll see, we'll discuss that next time. Results are available if published in open access journals. If they are published in other journals, then it's not really open access, it's not publicly available. Analyzable database data sets hosted by research data repositories in public domain, and there are few. including one that's only devoted just to them, that's UMIN in Japan. Analyzable IPD data sets can be requested via initiatives, projects, and portals, so their metadata is visible that they are there, but you have to make a request for them. So the trialist motto for me, although I know not many of you are trialists, but let's remember that, remind them if they ever recruit them. Like, by the way, I am also now participating as a patient in one clinical trial. And I had to sign consent form, and I was asking to whether they would register trial and that what will they do with the data. So the motto should be someone will use the data I collected. So let's say how and what. So my advice would be, if the trial is happening, register, report results, share data. Very simple. How to do that is include the data sharing plan in data management plan. At the institutional level, you can contribute to policy development of database and repositories. Learn how to share and find data. Find it in literature, on internet, R3 data, RDA, various initiatives, some of them I mentioned, and like studies like Impact Observatory. And then network, interact, and contribute to policy development and standards and guidelines. And whenever you publish and share the story, always in open access, whatever you do. And there are repositories like Figshare, you can post whatever your thinking is and protocol, and it's very easy and to do, and it gets a DOI, you can be cited and everything. Oops. So that will be the poll number 6 now, if I may ask for it. I hope we do have time. Okay, that's good. Thank you very much for this answering. So we shall hopefully do that screen. At the end, I would like to acknowledge some of the contributors, like the whole Impact Observatory Network. I realized exactly at preparing this presentation how important that network is. And then for funding, and Nevena for graphic solutions of presentation, she would have been actually co-author because she worked so much with me on it. Whatever is bad is mine, whatever is well done by the graphics, it's hers. And I added a couple of books you can read. We recently produced the 2nd edition of the Clinical Research Informatics, where I wrote one chapter and a couple of other people. And then, as you can see, quite interesting books to read. Some of them are very easy read, some of them are more, let's say, scientific.